Hello and welcome to this video on changing culture. So we've been talking recently about corporate culture and the way that we can classify corporate cultures. Now, what happens if we have a weak culture? What happens if the culture is not really working? In those situations, we might be forced with a situation where we need to try and change the culture of the organization in order for it to survive or to be successful. And whilst we recognize the need for change, change can often be very, very difficult. And in my personal business experience, changing the culture of the organization is one of the hardest things that a leader of a business or managers within the business can try and do. It's almost easier to start a business from scratch and establish a culture than it is to change an existing culture. And in this video, we're going to look at changing culture, why we might need to, but why it's so hard to achieve. Why is culture so important? Well, let's think about it. We've established that a culture is the values and assumptions deep within the DNA of a business. So what do people really think is important? How to get things done. And so that culture will have an impact on the values and attitudes of a business. And the values and attitudes really shape what we do within a business. And what we do within a business ultimately determines whether it's successful. So if you trace that backwards, the culture is really the foundation of a business in terms of its success, in terms of its adaptability, in terms of whether it's going to go on and thrive. And so it's really vital. And what happens when that foundation is toxic or needs changing or isn't working? Well, in that situation, we maybe need to change the culture. So in this video, we're going to look at particularly at difficulties in changing an established corporate culture. So why might we need to change the culture of a business? I'm going to put up here some ideas about reasons why we might need to change the culture within our business. So, the most obvious one perhaps to start with would be that we've got declining profit and sales. And so the shareholders aren't getting a decent return. What might cause this? Maybe we've got issues with low quality of standards of customer service. Maybe the management and the staff have kind of got us and them mentality and it's not really working very well. Staff are leaving, staff aren't coming in, things aren't getting done. Maybe the market changes, new competitor disrupting the market. Maybe there's change in the political and legal environment, society, change in ownership, management, economic conditions. Lots of different reasons why, as a result, the culture, the underlying values and assumptions of how we do things here might not be working and we might need to change. So some examples of businesses that were considered to have struggled because of problems with their culture. So Kodak famously didn't really see the change from film to digital. The culture didn't recognize that, it was too slow to react, and they failed as a business. Nokia were the dominant leader in the market in mobile phones, but failed to spot fast-moving challenges, failed to keep up. Something was wrong with their culture, and as a result, the business failed. Sony, again, had very much a sort of people worked in little separate groups. That was the culture within the business because they were the market leader, but it reduced their ability to innovate. And they had to go through a big process of trying to change their culture to recover. So not having the right culture can have an impact on the business's survival. Perhaps even worse, having a negative corporate culture can lead to really unethical or illegal activity. For example, hacking phones involved by this news corporation, behaving recklessly in terms of lending and creating the financial crisis, mis-selling drugs and bribing officials, elaborate scams of energy trading, rigging markets, mis-selling products. These businesses would say that we would perhaps argue that the culture here and within these businesses wasn't right and led to all these bad business decisions being taken. Now, Edgar Schein is a business theorist who's talked and investigated cultures within a business, and he identifies 3 levels of culture. And he likens it to the concept of an iceberg. So what we see above the water, he calls the artifacts. And these are the observable things that we can see quite easily. So what is the symbols of the business, the slogans of the business, the published list of values, so things like mission statements and objectives, what do they tell us about the business? Okay, so we can see those, and that gives a clue to the culture. But he argues that comes from a deeper idea. So what are our beliefs and values? So what are our ideologies? What are our goals? What are our aspirations? And these might be to do with shared experience that the employees have within that business. And where do those beliefs and values stem from? Well, these come from basic underlying assumptions. And these might even be unconscious. We don't realize that these are really the values that we have, or they're taken for granted. Well, this is just the way things are. And this determines the perceptions and the behaviors. So you would argue that there's a flow from the basic assumptions up to the beliefs and values, and they produce the things that we see. And the most important ones that really shape the culture are down here at the bottom. What are the basic underlying assumptions? But they're also the hardest to change. It's easy to change a slogan. It's not really easy to change taken for granted belief or value. He recognizes that culture therefore is really, really important. And the only thing of real importance that leaders do is to create and manage culture. It's a famous quote of his. Now, creating and managing culture is quite difficult. He also talks about the difficulty in terms of changing culture. So here's a quote from his in the top right-hand corner. He starts with, company cultures are like country cultures. Never try to change one. Try instead to work with what you've got. So he would go with the idea that you shouldn't really try and start with the idea of changing a culture. Start with the issue that the organization faces, and then try and say whether the existing culture gets in the way of resolving those issues, rather than trying to change fundamental values and beliefs. Always try and think of the organizational culture as a source of strength, even if some elements are dysfunctional. If major changes are needed, try to build on existing cultural strengths. So often students have the idea that it's quite, we just come in and say, well, this is clearly a power culture, so it's easy. We'll just replace it with a task culture. That can be quite difficult to do in reality. So maybe we have to recognize a power culture exists and it's getting in the way of solving this particular issue. So what can we build on? How can we just slightly adjust it so we can deal with this issue? Major cultural overhauls are rare and they're hard to do and often fail. It's a long race. Culture, fundamental beliefs and values evolve slowly over time. Momentum is hard to sustain. So the advice here to business people would really be only attempt a major overhaul of the culture of the business if it's really necessary. So why is it so hard? Why is it so hard to change a culture? Well, people are naturally resistant to change. If it changes, there's a risk, a fear. What will happen to my job? I'm used to this. I believe in this. It's quite a painful process to go through to change my values. At an oil company, changing my value, I'm here to solve a problem, providing people with energy, and someone comes around, you're destroying the environment, you change these values. That's quite difficult for me to get my head around. Perhaps a lack of trust. Why are you trying to change the culture? What is the reason for this change? Is it for you trying to get us to do something differently so you'll gain? Is this in our best interests? It can take time to embed new values and embed habits. Have you ever said, right, this year I'm going to be really healthy, I'm going to change my values, and then how long does it last? It takes time to embed these things properly. Also, if you change the culture, how does that relate to your stakeholders? So your customers go, oh, well, I thought you were a petrol company, and now you're telling me actually you do solar panels and wind farms. I don't understand. So there's again a risk for the sort of the existence of the business and other stakeholders through the process of change. But why might it be crucial? Why might we sometimes left with no choice? Well, the main one here normally would be to improve performance. If we're struggling for the survival of the business and we think it might be to do with the culture and the way that's affecting decision making within the business, we might have to change it. Because if the culture changes, it can change our strategy, making a more risk takers, or seeking greater rewards through changing the culture of the business. Particularly if business has gone through a takeover or merger, then two cultures come together and we're forced to make a change. One of them has to change so that the new business as a whole has a consistent culture. As we've recognized already, this does affect staff and stakeholders, and it can cause problems. A good quote at the bottom here: there is no such thing as the right culture. What matters is whether the culture is right for the business circumstances. And that's something we must always ask ourselves. Given the context of this business, is this culture going to help us succeed? So changing a culture can be slow because it involves changing individuals' values and beliefs. The organizational culture can be a barrier to change. Some organizations are designed and set up to embrace change, while others find change difficult to deal with. The external environment can influence organizational culture, may bring about the change. And the key issue is whether the company can foresee the change. If we know the change is coming in advance, we can start to change the culture slowly and nudge it, as we said earlier, build upon what's already there. If we leave it too late, then we can have a lot of resistance to change. How the leadership manages the change process is also obviously really, really crucial. So it comes back to this idea that change, often we need change within businesses and change a culture to get the best results. But again, we reiterate that change is very, very difficult. The evidence is changing a culture is a very difficult thing to do, and that a better starting approach, as Edgar Schein would say, is to look at the existing culture and how can we build on that to address the problem that is presented to the business. So in this video, we've looked at the difficulties in changing an established corporate culture. That's it. Thank you very much for listening.